All right, so although the topic today is urbanism, here's a disclaimer. I'm actually not here as an expert in urbanism at all, but really just as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about cities, thinking about their architecture, about the spaces in cities, how they're used and how they're perceived. And these are really ideas that have shaped much of my work to date. And so what I wanted to really do today was to show a range of work from projects that I feel have laid the foundation for my practice, to projects where I was honing my interest in data visualization, and finally to some more recent professional work that really reflects where I'm at in my practice today. But first I wanted to start by sharing my story and really how I became interested in cities and urban design in the first place. So here's my story. I grew up in Lübeck, which is a town in northern Germany. This looks a little washed out, if there's any way to get the picture a little better. So Lübeck is in the north of Germany, right near the Baltic Sea. It's about 30 minutes from Hamburg, if you know Hamburg, and it has a population of about 250,000. It's also the birthplace of the writer Thomas Mann. That's a little better. And Lübeck is really unique in many ways for a city of its size, and in particular through its architecture. So like Manhattan, the old city of Lübeck is on an island, and it's enclosed by the river Trave. And so it has a very high density of buildings on the island. Lübeck was also the capital of the Hanseatic League, which was a powerful Northern European trade group. And so it really reached its peak in the 15th century. And that is actually the time from when much of Lübeck's architecture stems back. And this is the context that I grew up in. However, when I was younger, we moved around a lot. So we spent several years living in the US, some years living in England before then returning to Germany. And it was by the time that I came back to Lübeck that it had really been long enough that I felt, in a way, like a stranger in a strange land. And this feeling has really followed me ever since. So in any of the cities that I've visited, any of the cities that I've lived in, really after Lübeck, I've always felt like a perpetual tourist, kind of like an outsider looking in, trying to understand the essence of these places and how people relate to them. I was an art major in high school, and in a project that I still remember today, quite vividly, I spent several weeks documenting the streets of Lübeck through photographs. And this was really the first time that I can remember when I was trying to understand the essence of the city, the culture, the people, the architecture, all through the lens of the camera. So then a little while later, I moved to the US to study design. And it was during my graduate work at Yale that I discovered Kevin Lynch, who was an urban planner and a professor at MIT. And in the 50s, Lynch had started a 5-year project on understanding urban form. And so in particular, he was interested in how people perceived the city. He would ask participants to draw maps of their cities, of their neighborhoods from memory. And he later synthesized these drawings into archetypal maps of these cities, including Boston and LA. And so these maps obviously were not based on the true geography of the city, but rather on people's perception. And Lynch found that people formed their mental maps based on 5 elements: paths, edges, nodes, landmarks, and districts. And together, these elements formed what he called the imageability of the city. So this work actually had a strong influence on me, and much of my work is, as I found, really based on the 5 elements that he identified. But most of all, I was interested in the intersection of perception and reality, so where the physical environment of the city comes into contact with the realm of ideas. During the first few years of living in the US as an adult, I kind of had this pattern of moving to a new city every 2 to 3 years. So I started out in New York, spent a few years there, moved to New Haven, and then finally I moved to Chicago. And it was actually in Chicago where I was living downtown in the Loop, surrounded by all this incredible historical architecture, where I really felt the drive to understand the history of the urban environment. And that actually led me to develop an experimental project called 1833. So this piece is about representing the original city limits of Chicago, which was actually founded in 1833. And it was an attempt to not only document this border, but to also experience the scale of the original city relative to the city of today. So I went out and traced the original borders on foot. I took my camera and I documented the path I took through photos that I took at regular intervals along the way. And like I had previously in the images of Lübeck, here I was using photography really as a tool for mapping the urban environment. And of course there are invisible historical borders really in every city. They are hidden, but they are present, they are there. And they have shaped the city, and in some cases continue to shape the city. And so ultimately this early piece was a study on how the urban environment contains layers upon layers of meaning that we all experience, yet that are really hidden from plain sight. So that was 1833. When I moved back to New York City a couple years later, I then continued to develop similar ideas with a project that I called Brooklyn Bridge. And at this time, I was interested in shared experiences, so the shared experiences that we all have living in cities. And I was particularly focused on landmarks, such as the Brooklyn Bridge, landmarks that really serve as magnets, bringing together people from all over the world, from many different backgrounds. And so this piece was based on crowdsourced photos of the Brooklyn Bridge walkway that I was able to find on Flickr. And these were photos licensed under a Creative Commons license, and that made it possible for me to reuse and remix these images for this work. And so I sequenced I think it was over 150 images to really form an idealized walking trajectory across the bridge, beginning on the Brooklyn side and gradually moving over towards Manhattan. And so where the last project, 1833, was really about revealing the hidden meaning in the urban fabric, this piece deals more with projecting an idealized sense of place. And like Kevin Lynch's study, the piece aims to represent an archetypal experience of crossing over the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And it does this through the juxtaposition of hundreds of individual experiences. So in these earlier projects, I was using photography as a medium for understanding cities, really by looking back at the past. But then over the next few years, I started to shift my focus a bit to explore ways of showing the city more as a living organism. And this is one of the first projects to come out of that time. So this is Pastiche, which is a project I worked on together with Ivan Safran. And it is a dynamic, immersive data visualization of New York City that represents people's associations with the city. And it does this through keywords that are shown in relation to individual neighborhoods. So both keywords and neighborhoods are rendered typographically, and they are shown in geographic proximity to one another. And so together they really form a typographic map of the city. And the vertical orientation of the labels references the vertical architecture of Manhattan. And by doing that, I tried to suggest a parallel cities of associations, of impressions, that mirrors the physical environment of New York. The keywords are gathered from geocoded Twitter data, and this allows the visualization to update in real time. So that's always current based on what people are saying about these individual neighborhoods. And selecting a label would then highlight other related neighborhoods that are related through sharing the same keywords. And so this gives you a way to then see real-time relationships between different areas of the city. This is a little dark, but from a distance you can then see the shape of the city emerge from the data. Is there any way to increase the contrast just a bit? So that was Pastiche. And the next project is called Invisible Cities and explores actually very similar themes to Pastiche. This is a project that I worked on in collaboration with Lee J. Shah. And similar to Pastiche, it too is an immersive data visualization of New York, but also of several other cities, including Seattle and including Tokyo. And Invisible Cities was really inspired by this diagram by the French situationist Guy Debord. And the diagram shows Paris neighborhoods isolated from their urban context, linked by walking paths, walking trajectories. And so it represents a city that is defined not by the permanence of the architecture, but rather by the experience, by the moment. And this is the idea that we tried to capture in Invisible Cities. So this project aims to reveal the social networks in the urban environment, and it draws from Flickr and Twitter in terms of depicting social data on a three-dimensional base map of the city. The data that we aggregate is represented as the white points that you can see here. And over the course of 24 hours, the data will then start to cause the landscape to deform. So showing the highest, the areas of highest and lowest density of social data over that period of time. And we also identify topics. So we look for topics in the data. We actually look for matching keywords in tweets and in photo captions. And these topics are represented as pathways, linking individual pieces of content. And this became a method for us to connect content in both time and in space. You can zoom in to view an individual data record, whether it's a status update from Twitter or a photo. And you can also go back in time. So you can go back up to 24 hours. And in the beginning, the landscape will start out flat. Over time, as you move forward, the landscape will then become more articulated, starting to show the first hills and valleys of the data streaming in. And eventually, you'll be able to see even bigger hills and valleys and also spikes for current events where they might be taking place at that moment in time. And so in addition to New York, as I mentioned, we also include Seattle. This is an image of Seattle. San Francisco. And Tokyo, among several other cities. And what's interesting is that you can really see the differences between these cities in terms of how the data is distributed. So where New York, for example, was very concentrated on Manhattan, Tokyo really shows the multiple city centers from Shibuya to Shinjuku and Tokyo Midtown. And we just finished refactoring Invisible Cities for the Leap Motion controller, which is shown here. And this allows you to navigate the three-dimensional information landscape through natural gestures. So the Leap version of Invisible Cities is a data visualization that we created at Schema, which is the design studio I started here in Seattle recently. And the focus of the studio is on projects that are at the intersection of interaction design and data visualization. And so in the time we have left, I wanted to show two more recent projects that we worked on at Schema, starting with Mapping Health. This was a project we did together with the Center for Public Health Nutrition at the University of Washington, and it was also in collaboration with the Urban Form Lab there. This is a project that was led by Dr. Adam Janowski and funded by an NIH grant, and it was part of the Seattle obesity study. And in that study, close to 500 participants were tracked over the course of 1 week each using GPS sensors. And the university was interested in health-related activities. For example, where did people go to shop for food? So we worked on two visualizations with the university, one of which I wanted to show here. And so this is a piece that shows movements for all 500 participants. And it's normalized to 24 hours that are represented in 1 minute video. So it's showing a day in the life of the city. The white lines show where people were traveling fast, meaning where they were driving or taking public transit. And the blue lines show where they were traveling slowly, so where they were, for example, walking or biking. And so over the course of the video, you can then see the fast and the slow areas of the city emerge. All right, and finally, I would like to show a project called Transit Patterns. And this is actually a series of work that the studio has produced where we were focusing on patterns of public transit in cities. And these first two videos show transit patterns for the cities of San Francisco and Geneva. And here you can see the ebb and flow as ridership increases and decreases over the course of 24 hours on a day in 2012 for each of these cities. You're actually looking at transit ridership for all forms of public transportation, from buses to light rail. And by comparing these two visualizations, you can really get a sense for the differences between these two cities. That San Francisco, for example, is planned along these major roads and arteries, whereas Geneva is more centralized and planned more around the downtown area of the city. I think that's about 24 hours. And the last project then is an interactive visualization of public transit ridership for cities all across the US. And here we looked at the time frame 2002 to 2012. In addition to the total trips per city, which you can see by rolling over the bubbles, you can also select to view trips per person, which actually enables for better comparisons. You can toggle different modes of transportation on or off, as well as controlling the overall time frame. And we actually separated the year from the month in order to show both cyclical patterns over the course of a year, as well as the overall trend for the 11 years time frame. The base map in the background is composed of individual transit hubs. And so that gives you a way to see the distribution of infrastructure across the country. And so transit patterns, I think, demonstrates how an interactive application has the potential to tell many stories from within a single set of data. And so, for example, New Orleans was among the top cities in ridership per capita prior to 2005. Post-Katrina, however, its ridership has decreased significantly. And so this is just one example of the kinds of stories that an application like this could tell. So to wrap this up, through much of my work to date, I feel that I've explored data visualization really as a tool for understanding urban form. And ultimately, I believe that data visualization can not only help us understand today's cities, but that it also has the potential to help us shape the city of the future. Thanks. So any questions? Yeah.
Are these project things that you're pitching, or do they come to you looking for that stuff?
Well, so most of these projects were self-initiated.
Okay.
The ones I showed in the end, actually Mapping Health was a client project that we worked on for the university. So they came to us. But then most of the work I showed was self-initiated, including transit patterns. That one actually was originally done for a competition through the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco. And so that, in a way, turned us onto the topic.
Okay.
And then we started producing more of these pieces. The early work I showed, Invisible Cities and Pastiche and some of the even earlier projects, those were all self-initiated. And it's interesting to me, kind of looking back, Invisible Cities actually started about 3 years ago. So that's really when the first iteration took shape. And we've just kept working on it since. And now, actually, with Leap, so with the Leap Motion controller, we're currently in the process, actually, of having it go up on their app store. So we're thinking of productizing it more. And it's kind of interesting to see the progression from more of an exploratory piece to now something that resembles more of a product, I guess you could say. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Where are you getting your data for something like that, traffic patterns visualization? Where are you getting your data?
Yeah, so
Where are people using it?
right, so the last one I showed, the interactive piece, I believe that one's using data from the National Transit Database. And there's a secondary data source as well. I think it's called RITA, and it's an acronym for something, and I just can't remember it, but you'll find it on the website too. But that was for the base map, so for the infrastructure data. For some of the other, so the transit pattern videos I showed, this was actually open data that was provided through the Gray Area Foundation. And it's open data that cities are basically collecting and making available to the public. And so some cities there are a little further along than others. I think San Francisco, New York, Seattle as well, I think are among the, some of the more progressive cities in the US to be using open data. So it's from sources like that. Yeah. Yes?
First, kudos to you or whoever chooses the music.
Oh, thanks.
Really
Yeah.
fitting the movement for the field data. My question is, with your later projects,
Yeah. Yeah, I think for the videos, I showed two of actually three videos that we have. There's another one for Zurich. I think the insights there, at least for me, were more around the city planning. I tried to, I mentioned this briefly in the talk, that you can begin to see the different structures of these cities. Where San Francisco is a bit more spread out, and even in terms of the activity, it's more distributed over the course of the day and more consistent. With a city like Geneva, you see a lot more of the ebb and flow. And you can also see the decentralized nature of the centralized nature of the city. Whereas a city like Zurich, also, I didn't show it today, but again, you can find it on the website. That also shows, in some ways similar to San Francisco, though with less activity, more of a disseminated, structure. So it's those insights that came out of the videos. For the last piece, I think it is those micro stories. When you focus in on the individual cities and you look at what events were happening at that time, then you can start to see potential correlations, like in the case of New Orleans. And there must be others, hundreds of other stories that you could pull out if you look at what was happening at that time in these cities and you contrast it with transit patterns. So yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering when we were talking about that urban health project.
Yeah.
What conclusions did they draw? What conclusions did you draw from that?
Yeah. So the study was the Seattle obesity study, as I mentioned. It's really concerned with health-related activity. In particular, and the university could do obviously a much better job at explaining this, but they're interested in where people shop for food and generally what sorts of health-related activities they pursue. And so they were tracked over the course of a week each, using GPS sensors. Participants also, I believe they also had a journal, so they could keep a journal as far as what they did every day. And I know that the team there, the Center for Public Health Nutrition, is still in the process of analyzing all of these data. But with the visualizations in particular, they were, I guess you can think of them as, quote-unquote communication pieces. So they're creating awareness, ultimately, for the study. So with the one I showed, this one, was really about the fast and slow areas of Seattle. Where do people bike or walk, and where are the areas that are more, car-based or public transit, where people drive through or use public transit. The second piece actually was on, it's again on the website. It shows where people actually go to shop, and it's based on proximity to supermarkets. And so you can think of them more as, I guess, creating awareness for this study. The insights were, where are the fast and slow areas in Seattle, and where are some of the more, popular supermarkets in the city versus some of the supermarkets that may see less activity. And the sample, by the way, was, I don't know if you could see, but in the beginning of the video, we actually showed the home locations. I should have mentioned that probably. The dots that appeared were the home locations of the 500 participants. And so it was actually a fairly distributed sample. Even though it was relatively small in size, it was fairly distributed both in terms of location and also demographics. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I was really interested to find out is sort of what are the next steps. So you've done a lot of these really interesting created, self-motivated projects, and you pull out these stories from them. Well, how do you then take those stories and put them to the people who need to hear them, who are doing city planning, who are doing these sort of need to hear this stuff to really
Yeah.
influence the quality of life?
No, that's a great question. And actually, if you have any thoughts, let me know. But I think you're right that data visualization is often, I think it's often about education. It's about shedding light on certain issues and helping you understand these issues better. But I think the logical next step would be taking action. So how can you use these insights and have them inspire action, basically? And so for some of the, for the urban, I guess I showed mainly city-related visualizations today. I think the logical next step for these projects would be having these insights somehow go back into the process of planning our cities and making our, improving our urban environments. And I think there are a couple of areas there that seem especially interesting, health being one. The environment, obviously, is another. Security would be another area. And so I think there are various areas where data could actually ultimately improve our cities. And so we're interested in that and how we could start to use visualization as a means to then begin to improve our urban environments. Yeah.
So as an urban master planner,
Ah,
I'm really
good.
excited to see what you're doing, and I do
Yeah.
have an answer to this question, because as I'm sitting here, obviously grew up on Lynch and at Christopher Alexander, all that sort of
Mhm.
stuff. Work on large urban environment infill.
Yeah.
Everything from the energy systems to whatever. But what's happening right now is the data is very quickly, we're in a short window, is going to be privately owned. And we need to keep it as open source and be aware. Even
Yeah.
here in Seattle, there'll be a request for proposal next week to sell our streets and infrastructure to one of two of the largest multimedia companies that will then sell us the data back. And I would like to see it stay open source and have it not controlled
Yeah.
by these handful of companies around the world. So when I'm working on a project, I get the same data wherever I am in the country, and it's just being sold as profiles, but it's not accurate to the place. But it is attractive to the people building the
Yeah.
place. And so we've got to keep this open.
I agree. I completely agree with that, yeah. Yes.
Got two questions. The first one, if you could talk just briefly about the tools you use to build your visualization. The second question is, when you're starting a new project, how much do you rely on bias and trying to prove a theory you already have versus serendipity and randomization, and just the stories come naturally out of what you
Yep. All right, so there were two questions. The first was about what tools do I use. The second is about bias and how much are the visualizations guided by an initial hypothesis. Excuse me. So I think for the tools, that's the easy question. We use a combination. For the work I showed today, it was primarily using processing, which is an open source programming language that is derived from Java, and it's a project by MIT. So we use processing quite extensively. It's actually a great tool for data visualization, among many other things. We usually, we've started using a database, a Postgres database, for the back end, especially when we start working with larger data sets. That's been quite useful. Yeah, so I would say those, processing, Postgres, those are the primary tools we use. As far as bias, I would say the way we usually begin a project with a hypothesis and usually a set of questions that we're interested in, sort of answering for ourselves, or even just in finding out more information about these questions. And what sometimes happens is that you find the hypothesis validated, which has happened on occasion. But the more likely case is that you'll start to discover new things, new insights that you wouldn't have really thought of from the beginning. And I've sort of come to this realization over having done this work, that I find the most effective visualizations to be open-ended. So in a way, like the last piece that I showed, if they are essentially open-ended platforms that enable people to really find their own stories within the data, they'll also, I think, ultimately become more compelling just as visualizations. And I'm more interested in that than I am in sort of controlling the message and the more persuasive side of the discipline. I guess you could say I'm more interested in the informational side of the design discipline and data visualization. So, are there any other questions? Yeah?
So it seems like data visualization
Mhm.
I'm philosophically opposed to infographics, but my boss make them. Talk about what is good status visualization? Like, what's your philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to what I was just saying. So keeping it open-ended, trying as much as possible to remove bias. And obviously that's, obviously it's futile. You can never remove bias entirely, but I think if you approach it in that way, you'll make conscious decisions along the way that are, in the interest of keeping it as objective as possible. And then just simply letting the data in a way speak for itself. So yeah, I mean, my answer to your question is really very similar to the answer I just gave. Yeah. Yes.
Your privacy regarding, especially with your systems, you can track patterns of people and individuals.
Sorry, privacy concerns related to?
Related to being able to track or selling data or being forced to give over data.
Oh,
Track people, either by patterns or by.
yeah, those are obviously big concerns. I don't think, let's see, so I mean, certainly are you referring to the mapping health piece in particular? Or just in general?
The fact that you can get that detail.
Yeah. Right. I mean, these are definitely concerns, and I think when you put together enough pieces of information, you can start to identify where it came from, and individuals as well. So I think with a project like Mapping Health, it's less of a concern, actually. I mean, it was certainly a concern for us working on the project, but in the resulting visualization, it is it's not such that you could really identify individuals at that level of detail. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, these are concerns. In some ways pertains more to the data than I think to what we might, well, I don't know. I guess it could also pertain to what we might do with those data. But I think it's just something we need to remain conscious of. And if, I guess if it's the case that it seems like it's revealing too much about the individual, I don't know, then it just has to be something you have to go about with caution. Yeah. Yes?
I know you talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to hear more about why do you think data visualization is important?
Why it's important. Yeah. That's a good question. I've been trying to answer that question for myself as well. I think it's about I think it is about the discovery of insight. And as I said, often we're surprised by some of the observations that we make after creating a data visualization. You start to see certain patterns emerge that you could not have predicted. And to me, I think the interest is there. That's where I see the value of visualization, that we can take a large, complex set of data and really, and I think this is maybe primarily also about the context that it's shown in, but even as people who are not maybe familiar with those data in a particular, at a particular level of depth, we can still derive insight from it. And I think as human beings, we're very trained to look for patterns. It's actually very easy to see patterns in data, and sometimes you have to be careful because those, the patterns may also be misleading. They may suggest a kind of a false correlation. But I think the value is right there. It's in being able to look at a complex set of data and discover insights, and then lastly, as I was saying earlier on, take action also based on those insights. So I think one of the most interesting areas is actually the quantified self, where there's a growing group of people who are tracking their own behaviors. I think it's largely health related, but it could also go beyond. And I think it's interesting that it starts to reveal patterns that you may not even have known about yourself, about the things that you do and the kind of behaviors you exhibit. And that's I think the potential and the power of data visualization. Okay, one more question. Yes.
So
Mhm.
And lately talking about taking action.
Yeah.
So I guess before we take action, I was hoping you could explain a little bit from your past projects and maybe future projects about how you're engaging people that don't have access to Twitter or a smartphone or those with voices that are typically not heard. Perhaps they don't have a car, I think, when they participate
Yeah.
in this study.
Yeah.
And maybe how you move that common core, maybe those future plans.
Right. No, it's a good question. Well, the answer is we haven't really engaged those people, unfortunately. We should look for ways to, yeah, I guess, if you look at platforms like Twitter and Flickr, yes, it is a somewhat self-selected audience, and that is, it's a bias, right? But at the same time, I think there's also, I mean, that aside for a second, I think the value of those platforms is, if you look back, for example, at the work of Kevin Lynch, right, that I shared, shared that image earlier on, we are now, I would say, almost in a place where we can derive similar insights from social data, but in real time. And I think platforms like Twitter and Flickr start to show, and others obviously as well there, start to show, how we could then begin to derive semantic content from the messages and the images that people are posting. So, I know that wasn't really your question, but that's the value, I think, of these platforms. As far as people who are, I guess people who don't have access, I don't know, that's a really good point. I do think that data visualization as a discipline does not rely on technology per se. In fact, it's sometimes actually good to even stay away from technology, especially in the early stages, and even just try to sort of, to map patterns, to maybe observe data on your own and through first-hand accounts. That is often proven helpful in the beginning stages of projects. But yeah, other than that, I don't know, I guess. But that said, I think it's probably more likely that more and more people will start adopting digital platforms rather than the opposite. So, yeah. All right, I guess that was the last question. Huh? Thank you very much.